This is Glenn Loury, Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. I'm with Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute. So grateful to welcome. Thanks for talking with me.
It's always a pleasure being with you, Glenn. Thank you.
Yeah, I should mention the Glenn Show is sponsored by the Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs at Brown, who are my employers, or at least one of my employers. Heather, we're talking about the book. Everybody should know about the book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. Heather is also the author of The War on Cops, which is an important intervention in the debates about policing and race and social justice. How has that book done? It must have had a huge impact, Heather.
Well, I don't know if it had a huge impact. It certainly did get out there, but my impression is that the anti-cop narrative is still pretty strong, even though it doesn't have the same sounding board in the White House that it once did. So it's, you've got a lot of institutional interests in the academy that are committed to the idea that policing is systemically racist. I continue, however, to meet people from high crime communities who tell me that they fervently support the cops, want more of them, and want more enforcement. So it's an ongoing battle. Arguably, the book had some effect on the rhetoric of the last presidential campaign, for better or worse, depending on your point of view.
Yeah, it's an ongoing battle. I think that's well put, framing the issue as the legitimacy of the policing, the exercise of authority and the maintenance of order, the racialization of that. The war is ongoing. I say a huge impact because I think you kind of have framed the narrative in a certain way, even if the people who are in control of the, sort of mainstream information and sort of cultural apparatus are, hostile toward the police. I think you raise a fundamental question. Have you seen the recent study of Roland Fryer on the impact of Justice Department investigations, the consent decrees of local police departments on violence in those cities? Right. I asked you a question. Have you seen his paper?
Well, I heard about it at the early part of the summer and was on the lookout for it, and yet I've not actually seen it. Is it out?
No, I don't think it's out, and maybe I shouldn't even discuss it very much, but I can't help but say this much because I think it provides some evidence. It will, in due course. He's dotting his I's and crossing his T's, no doubt. He's shown me a preliminary draft of a paper called Policing the Police. And it's Justice Department investigations of local police departments. That's the event that he's trying to assess empirically with, I think, very careful econometric methods, the causal effect of that event. If a city happens to fall under federal investigation, what's the subsequent consequence of that in terms of crime? And what he's contrasting is what were mildly positive effects of federal interventions. And by effect, I mean, you have the intervention, you look at the trend in crime before and after, and you try to discern whether the fact of the intervention caused the crime rate to go up or down. So positive effect means cause the crime rate to go down. A beneficial effect early in this century in investigations that were taking place in the first decade of this century. But he finds that after Ferguson, he's not saying that it's because of Ferguson, but after Ferguson, when you look at the effect of these investigations, they seem to be negative. Crime rates seem to be higher after than before the investigations. He finds, for example, in St. Louis, Baltimore, and Chicago, that if the investigations hadn't taken place, the homicide rate would have been lower by hundreds. He's talking about hundreds of lives. And he speculates that the reason that investigations by the feds cause crime, homicide, violent crime to go up is that cops are pulling back, that they basically are unwilling to risk being put in a situation where they might not be supported if they are using what is judged to be excessive force. So they're like on sort of mildly on strike in place. They're pulling back. And this is the effect that this is the so-called Ferguson effect that I associate with you. I'm not saying he's nailed this or that he probably denied that he even had evidence supporting your effect. But what I'm saying is he's finding these impact of federal investigations and the size of the effects are really very large, that really wants to make you think about the problem.
Well, certainly that is the Ferguson effect. And I would say that to that extent, I did have an impact because I put everybody on the defensive, trying to deny that there was any connection between officers' willingness to engage in what's known as proactive policing and crime rates. Proactive policing is the type of policing that is purely discretionary. Officers don't have to do it. What they're required to do is answer 911 calls. That's a reactive form of policing. There's already been a robbery victim, and traditionally, police departments measured their effectiveness by how rapidly officers responded to those 911 calls. Proactive policing, again, purely discretionary, is an officer using his powers of observation and knowledge of local crime conditions to try and intervene in crime before it happens. The classic example, but it's not exclusive to this, is the pedestrian stop, when officers see suspicious behavior, what they interpret as suspicious behavior, and question somebody. About half of those stops are accompanied by a frisk. There's been polling data, my own just talking with officers across the country did confirm that it's not just the formal federal investigation, but the entire narrative that became so powerful after Ferguson, the Ferguson riots, that policing was racist, and in particular, that type of proactive policing was racist, that did affect officer behavior. You used the term officers go out on strike. That's a phrase that was often used by the left, and I'm not accusing you of doing.
Yeah, and it's my word, not Fryer's. I want to be clear about that. But no, I'm. Yeah,
no, and I'm not saying that you're doing this with any kind of political agenda. I would just question the phrase as it's often used, because policing is political, and if a vocal segment of the populace is sending a message that a certain type of policing is unacceptable, is racist, in a sense, we want the police to respond by doing less of it. So it was always amusing and perplexing to me to see the traditional cop critics, on the one hand, complain about pedestrian stops and other types of proactive policing, and that would also include drug enforcement. And then when the cops would back off of those forms of policing, they would accuse the cops, and Charles Blow was famous for this, of not doing their jobs and being petulant and going out on strike, in essence. Well, you can't have it both ways. So in any case, Fryer, I look forward to his paper, and even before that, we have the data that in 2015 and 2016, once the Ferguson effect was well underway, an additional 2,600 Black males were killed over the course of those 2 years, compared to what the numbers would have been had they remained at their 2014 levels. The press doesn't give a damn about those 2,600 Black lives. In Chicago, there was 4,300 Black people shot in 2016. That's one Black person every 2 hours. If 4,300 white people had been shot in Chicago, it's unthinkable. It's unthinkable. There would have been a national revolution.
Yeah, I agree. Let me say something, Heather. I agree with you 100%. I can't help but say that. I wouldn't quite put it as sharply. They don't give a damn about their lives, but I hear you. I don't want to rebuke you for that. What I want to say is, I want to put this in somewhat larger context, because I'm asking myself, where does this anti-cop sentiment come from? Okay. Now, you've been very clear in saying, in the context of police violence, that blacks more likely to be shot, unarmed, et cetera, we could get into the weeds on the statistics, but you have said, look, they're more likely to be involved in crime. They're having more encounters with the police in situations which might lead to shootings. You can't just compare the proportion in the population to the proportion who are involved in shootings by cops. You have to compare the proportion who are involved in crimes to the proportions who are involved in shootings by cops. And if you do that, there's probably, you wouldn't say this, too few, quote unquote, in terms of the proportionality predicted of African Americans who are actually being shot by cops, based on what you would anticipate if you looked at how much they're involved in crime. And I want to stipulate all of that. I'm not going to argue with you about any of that. I think one could argue whether there should be, if the crime goes up by 50%, the shooting should go up by 50% or not, whether there's a linear relationship. But that would be a second order argument. What I want to say is, suppose you're a member of a community and of an ethnic group / class of people in whom that's actually true. The crime rate is higher. They're victimizing you. Okay, so you're being victimized by this higher crime rate. Crime rate is higher. So proactive policing in your neighborhood is going to mean stops, and some of those stops are going to lead for frisk. And they're going to be the residents in your neighborhood because that's where the crime rate is high. You're seeing the cops in part as, because not everybody in the neighborhood is committing the crime. And some of the people are going to be stopped. They're going to really have a deep resentment about the fact that they were stopped, although you could argue that that's the price you pay in order to have the security that you want in that situation. But around this experience of higher encounter with the police and of more intensive scrutiny by the state because the crime rate is higher in your neighborhood and amongst your people, you're the one who's on the kind of short end of the stick on this thing, and you can't be surprised that resentments would arise. And the other thing I want to say is that these activists and these journalists, you mentioned Charles Blow, I mean, you say they don't care about the lives. Well,
no, I say the press doesn't. Yeah, I mean, generally the press.
Yeah, but what I mean is,
Sean,
I've said this here before, people get mad at me. I think there's a kind of a shame. There's a kind of, if you were to face up to the actual reality of it, it would be profoundly demoralizing. There's a kind of denial. I mean, I'm rambling a little bit, and I hope I'm not completely incoherent, but I just want to say this. Mass incarceration thought of as an assault on Black people. What is that trope about? Mass incarceration, a person with straightforward logic could argue, is the implication of mass criminality, right? It's not as if the police are going around rounding up people based upon their race. They're enforcing laws, and the consequence of the enforcement is falling disproportionately on Black people. People cite that as if it's an accusation of the system, when it's actually a confession of weakness and pathology. The fact of mass incarceration is a reflection of the vastly disproportionate overrepresentation of African Americans among offenders. The people try to slough it off on drug laws, and then they act as if they're talking about nothing. And then you look at the numbers, drug laws don't come anywhere close to accounting for things. You look at the homicide numbers, you have to put the chart on an order of magnitude different scale to put the graph of Black and white homicide offending or victimization rates on the same chart. This is a shameful, devastating reality that people are in denial about. And there's a kind of inversion. The cops is the enemy. If you were to withdraw the police, which has partially happened from some of these communities, the consequences would be, as you said, absolutely devastating for the people who live there. The cops are not the enemy. I could go on. Way more white people than Black people are killed by police in this country every year, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on. When a Chicago policeman, as you know, was killed yesterday, but previously in this year, Chicago policeman on duty was murdered at the bottom of a stairwell across from City Hall. He was a commander. He was murdered by a black man. No one wrote a story that said, white, heroic police officer killed by black criminal. And yet, the Black Lives Matter people who want every time a white cop shoots a black youngster to make a federal case out of it are speaking in exactly that kind of language. They're speaking in the racialized victim imputation language of the cop was white and the criminal was black. Well, what when the criminal is the one who's killing the cop? You want to put that in racial terms too? So anyway, I'll stop. But I understand at some level the instinct to blame the system for failures in one's own community. But when it comes to the point of delegitimating the very instrumentalities of the state that are essential to the preservation of the life and the liberty of the people who are living there, it's profoundly counterproductive. So I meant to agree with you, I guess, at the end of the day.
Well, I certainly agree with everything you said there, and I'll just throw out some numbers to back you up. 42% of all cop killers over the last decade have been black males, although black males are 6% of the population. A police officer is 18 and a half times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a cop. And a much larger proportion of white and Hispanic homicide victims are killed by cops than black homicide victims. Fully 12% of all whites and Hispanics who die of homicide are killed by a cop, compared to 4% of blacks who die by homicide who are killed by a cop. So if we're going to have an anti-cop Lives Matter movement, it would actually make more sense to call it white and Hispanic Lives Matter. The reason for that 3-to-1 disparity is, as you say, because the absolute number of black homicide victims is so massive. It's larger than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined by a couple thousand. And again, or actually not, it's larger, not by a couple thousand, but it's larger. That is the problem that we should be talking about, because those, I think it's about 7,000 blacks who are killed every year, they're not killed by whites and they're not killed by cops, they're killed by other blacks. I think that there's always room for cops to improve their attitude towards the public, towards everybody. They need to be constantly retrained in courtesy and respect. They develop hardened edges. They can be extraordinarily offensive to deal with. And yes, being stopped and questioned and possibly frisked when you're innocent of any wrongdoing is humiliating and can be terrifying. And that is a crime tax that is unfortunately paid by members of high crime communities over and above the risk of becoming yourself a victim of a drive-by shooting or a robbery. As for your point about it being demoralizing to accept the underlying reason for a disproportionate police presence in minority neighborhoods, I agree with that, and that applies to all groups. Kevin Williamson from the National Review, the infamous Williamson who was hired for a day or two by the Atlantic and then fired because he had spoken with insufficient care about abortion. But he wrote an article during, I think it may have been during the Trump campaign, but basically lambasting working class and underclass whites for whining about large-scale, low-skilled immigration when these white whiners were unwilling to move to work, were not showing the same hustle as immigrants, and of course, were wallowing in the opioid epidemic. Well, Williamson's message to working class whites was not greeted with enthusiasm, let's say that. So I think it is tough for any group to accept responsibility, and it's tough to be lectured to by some other group. So it's understandable, this desire to turn your eyes away. But I would say, to maybe sort of move to my latest book, is that one of the, I sometimes think that the big divide between a so-called conservative outlook on the world and a liberal one is whether you place much emphasis, if any, on behavioral differences that may explain the socioeconomic differences that we see. And I think I'm just generalizing here, but conservatives such as myself are more inclined to look out at the world, see very real differences, and attribute those to the choices that people make, whether it's with regards to out-of-wedlock child rearing, staying in school, working full-time at a job, deferred gratification. And a liberal, again, gross generalization, and there's many exceptions, is more likely to see structural explanations, endemic racism, implicit bias, unfair laws of distributing wealth, property rights.
Let me amend. I hope you'll think it's a friendly amendment. It's not as if these liberals don't know that the behavioral differences are there. It's like, who is responsible for the behavioral differences? They want to say that the behavioral differences themselves derive from structural phenomena, and it's not, quote unquote, the fault. But I think that's a mistake, because the issue really is not whose fault it is. The issue is, how can the circumstance be altered?
Okay, but I disagree. I get that, but I disagree, at least when it comes to crime. They are in complete denial about crime rates. I talked at college campuses, and the accusation is inevitably, oh, well, the cops are hiding the white bodies. Somehow there's violent street crime going on in white communities that we just are not being told about. There's one excuse after another about black crime rates. And as you said the differences are at a level of exponential. It's 10 times. If you chart out the homicide commission rate of white and Hispanic males between the ages of 14 and 17 and compare that to black male homicide rates between the ages of 14 and 17, you need a scale that is 10 times higher for blacks. So the differences in crime commission are enormous, but they are completely denied with a set of extraordinarily tortured explanations, in my experience. As for out-of-wedlock child rearing or study habits, possibly it's admitted, but very often, the New York Times in the 90s was writing article after article about poverty and would focus on poor single mothers. Was it ever mentioned that the mother was single? Was this brought in? Was it ever asked, where's the father? It was as if these were virgin births. So I disagree. I would say the same thing about the academic skills gap, which is the explanation for why we don't have
Hold on, let me respond, because I can't take seriously anybody who denies the reality of the fact that criminal offending rates differ by race on an order of magnitude in some cases, or who would elide the fact of the huge disparity in academic skills presented. We're going to talk about a book about what's going on in the universities momentarily, I promise. Anybody who denies either the reality that 7 in 10 newborns who are African American are born to a woman without a husband, or who asserts that is inconsequential for the subsequent development of that infant, is not a serious person. So I meant to restrict my attention to serious people when I said what I said. These are not debatable things that you were talking about. It seems to me the only issue is, what are we going to do about it? But okay, I'm not going to dispute that you go to campuses and have people during the Q&A say stuff like what you said. I just don't take them seriously.
Well, then you can't take seriously any college administrator, because every discussion of diversity on campus in the faculty is conducted in a complete vacuum with no mention whatsoever of the fact that in 2016, there was one Black graduate with a PhD in computer science. Now, how every department in the country is supposed to have proportional representation of Blacks in computer science when there's one who graduated, there were about 6, I think, in computer engineering, is absurd. And yet, again, this discussion about diversity, which is a proxy for saying that the America is systemically biased, whether it's against females or so-called underrepresented minorities, is conducted in an absolute absence of any discussion. This summer, the New York Times had a front page article covering the fact that then Attorney General Jeff Sessions had withdrawn a set of guidances put out by the Obama administration to basically encourage schools to use racial preferences, something they don't exactly need encouragement to do. And the Times wrote a massive, thousands word article without ever once mentioning the academic skills gap. And instead, the whole discourse was phrased in terms of equity, that this was, schools are still striving for equity, as if we're trying to desegregate Ole Miss in the 1950s.
This is the cousin of the thing we were just saying about mass incarceration, where people will take the fact of the racial disparity and the incidence of incarceration as an indictment of the society and not a revelation of the behavior patterns that are so different. And likewise here, people take the disparity in academic achievement and performance, which is what calls forth the need for some kind of special affirmative action intervention to get the representation numbers of underrepresented groups up. They take that as an indictment of the system somehow, when in fact it's a revelation of the disparity in intellectual development. I'm not going to say people don't have the capacity, but I think, when it comes time to decide who's going to get into a really high profile, I try to make this point. I've been critical of affirmative action of late. I try to make this point with some of my interlocutors that if you're running a graduate program in economics, you're not going to admit somebody who can't actually do the work. It's only if you can disguise the fact that the entry qualifications are disparate by a large amount by hiding it in the sociology department. People could get mad at me. I'm sorry, I apologize. Hiding it in the African American Studies department. Again, I apologize to my colleagues who are going to get mad at me, but I'm serious. You have the university, you have a very rarefied intellectual enterprise, and it's still going on, Heather. The physics department is still doing real work. The philosophy department, they're still reading classical texts. I'm not saying they're not unaffected. I know you are concerned about undermining the integrity of the sciences, but I'm saying I'm in the university. I know that the real work is still going on. But we have this patronizing policy toward the underrepresented minorities where we pretend that there's a huge gap in SAT scores and it has no implication for what's going to happen post-admissions. I know PDRC at Decano has disproved that in the context of Duke. I know you know that because of the book, but I'm just saying we pretend like it doesn't matter and we hide it. We hide it and then we pretend that it is inconsequential, but it's very... Anyway, so I'm agreeing with you again about that. My concern is that we don't deal with the underlying problem, which is the disparity between the groups and the acquisition of these talents, because the world is moving on, and the importance of being able to master these skills is becoming greater, not less. And we're going to have hell to pay here in the longer term, I think, for not addressing the real problems.
Well, I generally am not attracted to sort of, I don't know how to characterize it, conspiratorial or economic determinist arguments for institutional arrangements, but one could take the argument that why are we so determined, or why are at least universities so determined to suppress any knowledge and therefore a concerted effort to change the vast academic skills gap. And one could see it as self-interest because you now have on these campuses these multi-million-dollar, grotesquely bloated diversity bureaucracies who have no purpose except to inculcate in students a sense of victimhood and oppression, which is completely delusional. There has never been a more tolerant environment in human history towards society's traditionally marginalized groups than a college campus. So for any student, I don't care if he's green, purple, or blue, to think of himself as oppressed on a college campus is ridiculous. It is a fundamental misreading of reality. Nevertheless, these diversity bureaucracies exist. They grow. You know, the vice chancellor of equity, diversity, and inclusion at UCLA makes over $400,000 a year. That's multiples more than starting faculty salaries. It could support free tuition for a dozen students.
Yeah, Heather, the football coach is not badly paid either. I mean, we economists can understand immediately how such a person would get to be $400K a year. It's supply and demand. I'm not saying he or she are worth it. I'm not saying that at all. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that if you got every other university like UCLA bidding for the services of the same people, their salaries are going to go up. But I'm not disagreeing with you, not at all. I see it here myself. I serve on the faculty executive committee, which is the committee over all the committees of the faculty here at Brown. It's a 3-year term, and I can't, of course, talk about what we talk about. But I can tell you that that's a lot of what we talk about. And we have meetings with these colleagues of mine in the administration who I respect to a certain point, whose job it is to oversee Title IX stuff or to worry about affirmative action in the hiring of the faculty or to deal with campus life issues because we got a third world center and we got a, you know, again, I'll get into trouble if I just keep talking about this because these people are my colleagues here. But it is sprawling. It's self-justifying. I agree with you. I think you might caricature. They might be more nuanced than you allow.
Please, I'm not going to allow that. I mean, it's ridiculous.
You're not going to allow that there's more nuance than you allow. Go ahead.
Well, you know, they put fancy terms on this. They call, we're compiling diversity metrics. All this means is you count the number of females and so-called underrepresented minorities in your faculty each year, and you say, well, it doesn't match the population figures at large. Therefore, we must give out more implicit bias training. And if I can just complete my thought,
you can.
The diversity bureaucracy has an interest in not closing that gap because it becomes an extraordinarily vicious cycle.
Okay, I should come back to that. Okay.
Where students are brought in with these vast racial preferences. And I know you discussed this with an earlier guest, your friend, the economist, labor economist.
Yeah, Lawrence Kotlikov.
Right. The mismatch theory is very profound and empirically based, that students who are brought in under a preference of the magnitude that is typical for racial preferences, alumni, you know, the legacy preferences, yes, those are preferences, but they are not anywhere comparable to what goes on in racial preferences. If we move this into perhaps the less contested territory of gender, the situation is the same. If I were admitted to MIT because MIT decided it wanted to artificially boost the number of female undergraduates, and I had an SAT score on math of 650 on an 800-point scale, and all my peers were admitted on a gender-blind basis, and they all basically averaged 800s, I would flounder in my first year because the teaching would be pitched to the average skills of my peers, which was way above mine. Whereas had I gone to Boston College as an intending engineering major instead of MIT, I would have been able to keep up and probably graduate in that intended major. The same thing is true for racial preferences. So it's not a black issue, it's an issue of mismatch. But the diversity bureaucracy has an interest in bringing these students in who struggle. I was at Columbia the other night defending the core curriculum, and girls...
Defending it against whom?
The student onslaught. It's
I'm sorry. I have to tell you this. My son, Nehemiah, he's 26 years old now. He's an alumnus of Columbia. He and I love the core curriculum. Are you kidding me? He got a real education at Columbia. He's an engineer. He's an astrophysics major at Columbia. But the core curriculum was like a lifeblood to him. I don't know what you're talking about. That really depresses me. The students are attacking the core curriculum?
Oh man, it's under constant assault. Your son was preternaturally wise, and I'm glad that he understood how his privilege, because I wish I had the core curriculum as an undergraduate. I have vast gaps in my knowledge because my teachers abdicated their intellectual responsibility and were not willing to say, we know something that you don't. These are the books that you must read to have any modicum of hope of having a vaguely adequate education. But no, the core curriculum at Columbia is under constant pressure.
Well, I can imagine, I know what the attack is. It's going to be, it's all dead.
There was a Facebook thread that exploded in 2015 of students complaining that reading these racist patriarchal texts and having a white professor put their health and safety at risk at Columbia. They said, it's fucking belittling to be told, that we have to read these things that create the racism, these books, Plato, Rousseau, Mill, that created the racism that I'm forced to live with on a daily basis here.
Wait a minute, come on. This is ignorance, and the job of the faculty.
Of course it's ignorance. Come on.
Let me say my sentence. The job of the faculty is to dispel such nonsense. It's nonsense. Heather, you and I both know it's nonsense. Those books are classics for a reason. I'm not saying don't talk about transgender issues at some point, but you can't just obviate 2,000 years of Western civilization or of world civilization. Again, I'm prepared to allow for a consideration of some of the concerns of people about broadening the thing, but this is the best. This is our legacy. This is our heritage. It's like when the Taliban blew up those Buddhist statues. I mean, you can't do that. You're going to reinvent it from whole cloth every time? I mean, that's ridiculous.
Well, the contested term in that is our legacy. And what we're moving towards, obviously, is a mutually exclusive zero-sum tribalism where students are taught to think that the most important thing about any individual is his gonads and melanin, and that knowing an author's gonads and melanin gives an ignorant student license to reject an author as thoroughly repugnant and not worth reading if those gonads and melanin don't match his own. So again, at this talk I gave up at Columbia, a student said, well, I come from the South. I'm struggling here. She admitted it. She said, it increases my struggle to have to read white male authors. Why can't I read books that are of relevance to my life, i.e. Black authors? And I quoted in my talk Ralph Ellison, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, all of whom spoke with heartbreaking eloquence about their affinity with the greatest minds of civilization.
Du Bois says, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. You remember that line? I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not.
Across the color line, I walk arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas and what soul I will, and they greet me with neither scorn nor condescension.
Wow, you memorized.
Absolutely a painful statement, because that was somebody who did live with lethal hatred, but nevertheless was able to see that ideas don't have a color and they don't have a gender, but the narrowing of the student mind, which is encouraged by the faculty, to me is really the greatest tragedy of what's going on in college campuses today, because professors have the greatest luxury. They have the greatest job in the world. They're all we ask is that they curate this legacy and, yes, develop new knowledge, develop new ways of understanding society, but they also have to teach students why to respect these works. They should be down on their knees in gratitude, and that's not what happens. Instead, I mean, You and I
That's what happens in my classroom.
Well, I'm glad your students should flock to you then. I mean, you and I may disagree on this, but the Columbia's core has already been extraordinarily watered down. It ends with sections from Catherine McKinnon, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Patricia Williams. Now, you know, I'm sorry, I do not think that these thinkers are of the order of John Stuart Mill or Locke or Tolstoy or Hobbes.
Or Hannah Arendt. Wait a minute, you've got women philosophers? What's wrong with Hannah Arendt?
And why not have George Eliot there? But she's not on
I'm with that too.
Yeah. So, you know, Columbia, I think the core is doomed. And directed studies at Yale, which is a program not for all undergraduates or all freshmen, but selected ones, is also one of the Western Civ. The professors, the young professors there are constantly apologizing for teaching white male authors. So all of this is on very, very precarious life support.
Okay, I should say this. I'm going to have colleagues, not that they're necessarily listening to this. I certainly, I hope not. Who will say, critical theory doesn't require that we bury our heads in the sand or that we become know-nothings or that we reject all of this. We're taking it on board. I'll name Charles Mills. Okay, Charles, you know who he is? He's not a colleague of mine. He's a Jamaican, African-descended Jamaican philosopher. He has a book called The Racial Contract, which is very widely celebrated, and it might be on the core curriculum list. It would be as deserving to be there as Patricia Williams or anything like that, because this guy's a serious thinker. And he rejects the Enlightenment at the end of the day because he says it's inherently racist. His argument in The Racial Contract is that this contractarian theory from Locke on down, and most contemporary instantiation is John Rawls, has an implicit devaluation of the black. It's white, not in its explicit articulation, but in its sort of tacit implication. I'm not doing justice to his argument, but that's the spirit of it. And what these critical theory advocates will say is, I don't want to take Locke or Hume or Kant or Mill or Rawls, for that matter, as defining how I want to think about this, because I've got a perspective. I've got a perspective from underneath, from the oppressed, the voice of those who are voiceless. There's going to be some argument like that. And I don't know what you would say about that. What would you say about the idea that there are intellectual implications of social stratification that, you know, should affect our pedagogy? You know, the kind of the powerless and stuff like that. I mean, about system critical, you know, anyway. I can't do it justice because I don't believe it, okay? Bottom line is I'm not doing the best job explaining this, but there is a counter narrative.
Well, you know, there is this anti-Enlightenment narrative that's out there, both on the left and the right, that arose in response to Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, and Jonah Goldberg's book. It's a stronger strand on the left, I would say.
The Goldberg book is The Suicide of the West. Yeah,
although, you know, the right doesn't like the celebration of Enlightenment because of the anti-clericalism of it. But I would say to me, it's a preposterous argument. I would love these critics, and I write about in the book a manifesto that was directed against me by so-called students of color at Pomona that has probably the most garbled iteration of the anti-Enlightenment diatribe that I've seen. I mean, it's just appalling in its confusion and inability to simply write a single sentence coherently. But this is ludicrous. I mean, name me a culture that has treated the other with any better respect than Western culture. It's absurd. You know, the other is still being stoned to death in non-Western cultures. The other was viewed as subhuman in most non-Western cultures. There was not a philosophy that developed. It was simply a instinct to treat any difference as somehow a threat. And so the idea that there's been tolerance for other groups in non-Western cultures is completely historically.
Okay, so slavery and the extermination of the
slavery's gone on. I mean, we know this. You know, these are bromides. We know that African tribal leaders were complicit in the slave trade. Sure. There was, you know, that.
So slavery is not an indictment of the West. Slavery is not an indictment of capitalism. Slavery is not hypocrisy. If it goes on for a century after the American founding.
Oh, slavery is absolutely hypocrisy. I mean, it is stunning that this country could live for 200 years in this very ubiquitous blindness, apart from the Civil War, but it continued beyond that at the grotesque violation of its founding principles.
So let me say this, Heather. So here's a kind of Charles Mills-esque argument. So you have slavery alongside the founding of the Republic and the ideology of liberty and so forth enshrined in the Constitution. So there's this huge hypocritical gap. How is it accommodated cognitively? How is it able to be at one and the same time the compromise that is slavery up until the Civil War and this ideal about the Republican setting off on an experiment in democracy? Well, it can only be done if the African slave is somehow perceived and understood as not quite fully a person. That's the only way really to square the country's ideology of the Enlightenment ideal with the reality of slavery. So that construction doesn't end with the legal extirpation of slavery. It carries on in social and psychological and political. It's institutionalized. Even the Constitution itself, the liberal lawyers would say, needs to be amended and so forth and so on in order to create the legal jurisprudence has to evolve in complicated ways in order to accommodate the aspirations to equal citizenship of the descendants of slaves. They're not equal citizens the day after the Emancipation Proclamation or even the day after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are ratified. They don't fully become equal citizens, you might say, until the century after that. And even then, there's arguments about whether or not they are. And all of these things are the long lasting fruit of what we're calling hypocrisy in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries in the United States. What would you say about that? And this is in a way an indictment of liberalism. If by liberalism, I retreat to a kind of blindness, saying, well, all I see are individuals. I'm not interested in their gonads and I'm not interested in their melanin. I'm simply seeing people in a free society. But no, it's not a free society that dropped out of the sky. It's a free society that comes up out of a historical root that in which these racial characteristics continue to have political salience.
Well, my question remains the same. You show me a culture, a country, a non-Enlightenment, a non-Western culture that has treated the other better. Is it better to have Hutsis and Tutsis killing each other? Is it better to have genocide based on tribal affiliation? Many American Indian, Native Americans, people were ruthlessly violent. I just don't see what the alternative is. I mean, what is really being proposed is the alternative to Enlightenment, that we should not strive for some kind of reason that does transcend individual particularities and prejudices. Again, I mean, you show me civilizations either in Asia or in Africa that have been tolerant of whether it's females, gays. Go try and have a gay rights parade or an LGBTQ trans parade.
You're right. I mean, the very idea of human rights, of some kind of...
Good luck with that. Good luck with having a rights parade in Afghanistan. It's not going to happen. And again, you try being a member of a warring tribe in Africa and see how you're treated. Now, they may not have the technology to exact a full annihilation, but the will was certainly there.
I accept your argument. Glenn Loury, accept your argument. I want to phrase it as a distinction between the Western liberal tradition and the United States in particular being perfect and being our best shot. I think you're arguing that they are very clearly our best shot, and that history has shown that. I think you'd have to acknowledge that they haven't been perfect. I think you've already acknowledged that. There's no reason not to strive for reform in those areas where we might or agree or disagree. Reform still needs to be investigated, even as we defend the tradition out of which the United States in particular and the Western liberal tradition more generally have come. The whole idea of human rights, the very intellectual ground on which you would criticize one culture from another, is a Western, is largely the fruit of this Western tradition. You're right. What would be your basis for saying to somebody in Uganda who is anti-gay that they ought to be tolerant? The only basis you have derives from these very philosophical roots that people are disparaging as dead white males. So I'm in agreement with you about that. Can we talk a little bit about Me Too?
Sure.
Okay, so Title IX under revision. You probably know more about this than I do. Secretary Betsy DeVos. I got a memo from the president of my university. It went to everybody, and it said, we're getting new guidelines from the Department of Education about Title IX. Maybe it's from the Justice Department. I don't know. You will know. And we are going to have a very, very open, deliberative process about how we, whatever. So they're concerned, I gather, about changing above the standards of proof in the hearings in which accusations will have arisen, that the so-called kangaroo court dimension of it, in which the accuser's position is superior to that of the person who's been accused. Usually it'll be a woman being the accuser and a male who has been accused. They're going to try to somehow balance that in a way that gives more due process to the person who's accused. Again, I invite you to speak about this at length. But what is at stake? We seem that the ground seems to be shifting now early in the Trump administration in terms of how Title IX issues are being dealt with and so on. So I'm inviting you now to talk a little bit about that part of your book.
Well, my book actually doesn't focus so much on the due process abominations of the so-called Obama administration, the Dear Colleague letter of 2011. I address more the underlying truth claim of whether there's a campus rape epidemic in the first place. I think other people have covered the problems with the rape tribunals enough. I do briefly talk about it. My concern is this idea that we're living through an epidemic of campus rape, which I think is completely fallacious. But I'm certainly prepared if you want me to talk about this recent regulations that have come out from the Education Department, Betsy DeVos, that rescind a guidance put out by the Obama administration that forbade colleges from allowing an accused to cross-examine his accuser. It required the very lowest standard of proof, preponderance of evidence rather than clear and convincing evidence to convict somebody. And what I find interesting in the response to this proposed draft regulation, and it should be said that from an administration that is often rightly accused of ignoring the law, Betsy DeVos is doing everything right. She's following traditional administrative rulemaking procedures by publishing the proposed regulation in advance, giving the public 60 days to comment on it, whereas the Obama administration issued a much more murky document known as a guidance letter or a Dear Colleague letter that is a fait accompli. It's not as if anybody was given any input into
Excuse me, you're saying they did that in order to circumvent the requirement to have a public comment period?
Well, sure, it's a lot easier. You do a guidance and you don't have to, it's not a formal change in the Federal Register that requires notice and comment. But, these are major issues that are absolutely deserving of a public debate as opposed to simply being a diktat announced by the federal government. So anyway, we're now in that process of a notice and comment period, and the response of the so-called victims or survivors advocates has been universally hostile. And I can only conclude that following very basic notions of due process is incompatible with maintaining the myth of ubiquitous campus rape. And we saw this, the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings was another instantiation of one of the theses of my book, which is the diversity delusion, which is that the diversity ideology with all of its fantastical commitment to victimhood is rapidly changing the world outside academia. And so the idea that we saw in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings that any self-described survivor is entitled as a matter of course to unquestioned credulity, the believe survivors mantra, that comes right out of the university, and it's now lodged itself into a very significant and powerful portion of the public and of public officials. So the new regulations that have been proposed try to level the playing field and say that the question of guilt and innocence is not an a priori given. It's something that is to be determined through a fact-finding process. And cross-examination is viewed as the most essential truth-finding mechanism developed in Anglo-American jurisprudence. The new guidance makes a very large concession to the maudlin survivors establishment by prohibiting the accused from himself actually cross-examining his accuser. This has to be done through an advisor, which is sort of a watered-down way of doing it, especially if a student can't afford an attorney.
I want to interrupt just to ask you a question, which has to do with, so Title IX is about gender equity in higher education. Am I correct in saying that? Is it not the same part of the law that governs women having equal access to athletic expenditures and things of this kind?
Right. That's what started the whole.
So a sexual assault is a bad thing, regardless of the gender of the person to whom it happens. It would be like if I stole somebody's backpack or I slapped them in the bar because they said something I didn't like. The university would have to regulate those behaviors. Likewise, if I assault someone sexually, it has to regulate that behavior, right? I mean, what's gendered about that? Why is that under Title IX as opposed to under whatever the relevant title would be to empower the university to enforce rules about property or about not shouting out in the middle of a lecture or anything like that? Do you see the question that I'm asking? Why is sexual assault under a part of the regulatory apparatus aimed at assuring equity for women, since sexual assault is not itself specifically? This relates to your claim about the myth of rape culture. Sexual assault is not explicitly or specifically an affront against women. Does this seem ridiculous to you, the question I'm asking?
Well, there's two aspects, I think, to your question. One, you're absolutely right that rape could happen to any sex, but obviously the whole premise of rape culture, the rape culture meme, is that we are living in a patriarchy and it is unidirectional, male to female. Now, an interesting fact of the various campus rape surveys that have been done by the American Association of Universities in the last couple of years is that the students who report the highest degree of sexual assault is the so-called LGBTQ community. So this is not a cis-normative heterosexual male on female problem in the largest numbers, quite the opposite. Now, that's an interesting little factoid, but the dominant discourse about this is that what we're seeing is just another way for males to suppress females. Why this goes under Title IX, obviously universities have an inherent power to punish student misconduct, and sexual assault would be one of those types of misconduct that they're inherently capable of punishing. Putting it in Title IX is just a way for the federal government to sort of get involved by withholding funds. Title IX gives the federal government the ability to withdraw federal funding from schools that are in violation of these rules. So that's why it's in Title IX. And it's also, it took some degree of legal redefinition to define sexual assault as a form of sex discrimination, which is what's prohibited by Title IX. But Catherine McKinnon and other feminist lawyers.
Well, I think that's the key to it.
But that's, to me, that's not as interesting a question as the question, are we in fact in this epidemic of sexual violence, which is what is the narrative that has come out of the advocacy movement. And the polls, the questionnaires that are used to determine that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 females are the victims of sexual assault over the course of their college career are highly suspicious. They violate the key principle of feminist ideology, which is always take the female at her word, because it turns out when you ask females directly, have you been raped, have you been sexually assaulted, they say no. 73% of all females whom the original campus rape survey characterized as rape victims, when asked directly, were you a victim of rape, they said no, I wasn't. And 43% of those rape victims went on to have sex again with the person that the rape surveyors, the researchers, characterized as their assailant. Now, I submit that that's inconceivable in the case of actual rape. But leaving aside the flaws of these survey instruments, behavior simply contradicts that there's this epidemic of sexual assault there. Every year, the flood of females trying to get into colleges grows more and more intense. It's a stampede. If there was, in fact, a degree of violence going on which is greater than we see, there's no counterpart to it. A 1 in 4, 1 in 5 incidents of a violent felony like that, even over a 4-year period, is unheard of. There would have been a movement to create single-sex schools years ago. You would not have sophisticated, highly educated mothers, baby boomer, Gen X, millennials, whatever, paying $250 an hour to prep their little toddlers to get into the best pre-K schools, all in the hope of going to college or Harvard or Brown 12 or 16 years later. So the behavior of the participants in this alleged rape tsunami simply contradicts it. I would also observe every Saturday night you have the same parade of college co-eds to the frat houses.
I got it, Heather. And this problem is coming very well in your book, and people should definitely read it. I want to say something to you, and it's a heretical thought that's playing around in my mind, because the enormity of this thing, the thing I want to say to you is, this is how it strikes me, and I'm not an expert. It's a power move. You ask, where does the myth of rape culture come from? This is a power move. So what happens is you have a college, you have men and women. They have a social life in which they interact, and sex is a part of that. There's alcohol, et cetera. There's fraternity, whatever. Sometimes they end up in intimate relations with one another, and that's always been a complicated aspect of human culture. It's always been, okay? They're men and they're women. Now, if you had somebody grabbing them by the hair, dragging them off, and clubbing them into submission before they accosted them, that would be the male physical violence dominating the female body. But you don't have that at all. You've got something that's much more subtle, interesting, and complex. And there's power. There's gender war of, access and that's going on. The myth, it seems to me, this is just me, my ex cathedra musing about this. The myth is the cover for bringing the force of the institution into that space of the interstices of that intimate intersection between boys and girls at this time in their lives when they are free from parental supervision and they are feeling the urges of their hormones and alcohol is flowing freely. It's bringing the institution into the interstices of that complicated dynamic with a thumb on the scale for the victim, for the disadvantaged, for the subject class. And I think you're right. I mean, this patriarchy meme looms in the background. The idea that men and women are unequal in some fundamental political sense is now injected into a college campus environment where, for all I know, women have an awful lot of power and discretion in what's happening. I mean, so anyway, that's what I see. And that's why I think places like Brown will end up resisting any kind of revision, that their comments are going to be very alarmist about the implications of leveling of the due process rules of these tribunals, because they're basically in the business of advocating on behalf of, quote, the weaker sex.
Well, yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, there's so much weirdness here, it must be noted. You have, first of all, in the 60s, students said to the adults on campus, get out of the bedroom, leave us to ourselves, get rid of parietal rules, get rid of rules about, you can't have males and females rooms, stuff like that. Leave us to ourselves. Now you have students asking campus bureaucrats to write highly detailed rules for coitus, which is the very realm of the irrational and the chthonic. And these rules, these 24-page rules on affirmative consent, look like something you'd have when you're signing a mortgage. And the idea that this is a normal response to drunken hookup sex is ludicrous. And what I see going on is, in fact, sexual liberation is having a nervous breakdown on college campuses. It turns out that the fundamental premises of sexual liberation, which was that men and women are equal in their libidos, equal in their drive for casual, no strings attached sex, were wrong. It turns out that females have more of an emotional response to sexual intercourse than males. They produce hormones. There's more of a sense of bonding. Males would be perfectly happy to have as many one-night stands as possible and walk away. And it is not about power. I mean, one of the chestnuts of feminist ideology is that this is not about sex. It's about power. No, excuse me. These males couldn't care less if the person they're betting tonight becomes president of the United States in 15 years, as long as she gives him access to her panties tonight. This is exclusively about the carnal impulses that you referred to just now, the hormones, Glenn. And yet nobody's willing to admit that sexual liberation was based on a myth of the identical natures of males and females. And so instead, you have these strange selective rehabilitations of various Victorian tropes that make the male the sole guardian of female well-being, so that both parties have deliberately drugged themselves blotto on the female's part precisely to lower her sexual inhibitions, but only the male is responsible for determining whether the female is capable of consenting. The female is not responsible for determining whether the male is responsible for making a rational consent choice. And again, you have these strange rules. The next step is clearly going to be, we need a college bureaucrat in every dorm room to make sure that the consent rules have been followed completely. But this is part of a larger strange thing where you have students now happily asking adults to regulate every aspect of their lives, whether it's writing rules for Halloween costumes so that they're not microaggressive and culturally appropriative, or you have Harvard's diversity bureaucrats sending students home with instructions on how to talk to their families over Thanksgiving about social justice. The bureaucracy grows larger and larger, and students, I mean, I'm no fan of the 1960s, but there was some putative instinct of rebellion there. We don't see that. There's a codependency between the ever-growing number of student groups and the bureaucracy that administers to their victimhood. It's a very curious situation. And when, this is why when conservatives confronting the hysteria around campus rape, virtually their exclusive response would be to bulk up the due process stuff. And in my view, that's ridiculous. For one thing, after you graduate, you're going to have to navigate the one-night stand scene on your own. You don't have an army of hundreds of Title IX bureaucrats to come in on your side. Why campus sex has this huge bureaucracy attached to it is somewhat puzzling. But that the problems of the tribunals are real, but they paper over the oddness of this situation, which again is based on, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding about male-female relationships and identities.
Would you extend that? That's very well said and very profound, Heather. Would you extend that?
I'm going to have to go soon.
Okay, me too. Would you extend that to the Me Too dynamic more broadly, to this so-called movement in this moment that we're in?
Well, I think there's obviously been real examples of predation in the workplace, of abuse of power. And again, a workplace situation is very different than the drunken hookup campus scene where you have equals as students, but when you have a boss who is exploiting his power over a subordinate for sex, that is a real grotesque abuse of power. But I would say that the Me Too movement, not surprisingly, has quickly morphed into simply another ground for imposing gender and oddly race quotas throughout the private economy, on the assumption that the reason, again, for any disparities in representation is due to sexual harassment and, the patriarchy. I disagree with that. I think that there are other explanations dealing with behavior, interests, skills that explain disparities in our culture. But the Me Too movement has moved way beyond those, I would say, fairly isolated instances of true predation in the workplace to a much broader agenda, which is forced gender equality.
Did you see that New York Times front page piece where they said, let's look at the men who have been deposed, and then under Me Too, and let's look at who has replaced them and how many of them have been women? They had photographs and everything.
Right.
And it exemplifies exactly the dynamic that you're talking about. Heather McDonald, author of the book, The Diversity Delusion, which we didn't talk enough about, but we talked about a lot of stuff. You gave me so much of your time. I'm grateful. Thanks for coming on the Glenn Show. I'm going to be in trouble after this because I didn't hold up the flag of the academic establishment the way I should have done. But Heather,
I'll come and defend you. Glenn, you can invite me and we can take them on together, okay?
I think
it wouldn't take
I think 500 of us ought to start a university.
Yeah, I'm afraid.
And I think we'd make a fortune. We could charge $100,000 per student per year tuition, and a lot of people would pay it because they know they were sending their kids someplace where they were going to get an education.
Right, they wouldn't get the bullshit, absolutely. We're not going to make excuses for you. We're going to have high expectations.
That's what I'm talking about. Okay, Heather, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay.